The storm had fallen like a clenched fist over the Virunga jungle. The sky had opened without warning, unleashing rivers of water that turned the trails into mud pits and the streams into furious torrents. The trees bent under the weight of the wind, and the sound of thunder rumbled like war drums between the mountains. The rain wasn't ordinary. It was violent, as if nature itself had decided to remind the world who was in charge. Carlos Mendoza, a ranger of the reserve, had gone out early to assess the damage. He wore rubber boots up to his knees, a backpack with basic supplies, and a radio that barely picked up a signal through the persistent humidity. His mission was simple in theory, but never easy in practice: to travel through the northern sector and make sure there were no injured animals or fallen trees blocking the main paths. After 20 years in the job, Carlos had learned that after every storm, the jungle revealed its darkest secrets. He walked for hours through the mud and the thick mist that clung to the ground like a ghostly shroud. His boots sank with each step, making a sucking sound that broke the oppressive silence. Everything was still. Too still. As if the jungle itself was recovering from the blow, holding its breath before coming back to life. The birds didn't sing, the monkeys didn't scream from the treetops, even the insects seemed to have hidden. But then he heard it. A cry. It wasn't the sharp squeal of a capuchin monkey or the hoarse croak of a toucan. It was something more heartbreaking, more primitive, more human in its desperation. A piercing, penetrating wail that cut through the damp air like a direct plea to the heart. It was the sound of something small, something vulnerable, something completely alone. Carlos froze. His heart pounded hard against his ribs. He turned his head slowly, trying to locate the exact direction of the sound. It came from ahead, among the giant ferns that bordered a small natural clearing where the sunlight barely filtered through the dense canopy. He moved forward carefully, pushing aside the wet leaves with his hands, feeling the cold water soak his sleeves. Every step was deliberate, cautious, and then he saw it. A small gorilla, soaked to the bone, trembling violently, clinging to a fallen branch as if it were the only thing keeping it from death. Its black fur glistened with water dripping from its tiny body, and its huge eyes, too large for its little face, were filled with pure, absolute terror. It couldn't have been more than 3, maybe 4 months old. It cried with all the strength its tiny body could muster, calling for someone who didn't answer, someone who might never answer again. Carlos felt something break inside him, a crack that split through years of professionalism and emotional distance. The infant was alone, completely, devastatingly alone. He crouched slowly, bending his knees carefully so as not to make any sudden movements that could frighten the terrified creature even more. The little one saw him and instinctively backed away, clutching the branch tighter with its tiny fingers, letting out a whimper that sounded almost like a question. "Are you dangerous? Are you going to hurt me?" Carlos extended his hands, palms up, in a universal gesture of peace, speaking softly, almost in a whisper. "Easy, easy, little one. I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe now." The gorilla whimpered again, a sound so fragile, so broken, it seemed about to fade into the damp air. Carlos looked around urgently, scanning the dense vegetation for any sign. There was no trace of the mother or any other family member, no sound of movement among the bushes, no characteristic scent of adult gorillas. The storm must have violently separated it, dragging the little one far from its family. Or something worse had happened, something Carlos preferred not to imagine. He made a decision. He took off his rain jacket, immediately feeling the cold of the morning against his damp shirt, and spread it out in front of him like an offering. Then, moving as slowly as if time itself had slowed down, he approached the little one. The gorilla tried to back away, pushing itself with weak legs, but it was too exhausted, too scared, too drained to truly flee. When Carlos finally wrapped it in the waterproof fabric, feeling the light, fragile weight of its body in his hands, the infant stopped crying. It only trembled, shuddering with spasms that ran through its small body. He lifted it carefully, as if holding something infinitely precious and fragile, feeling its light weight against his chest. The little one buried its face in the jacket and let out a soft sound, almost a sigh of surrender. as if it had finally found something solid to hold on to amid the chaos. Carlos felt a knot tighten in his throat, threatening to choke him. "I'm going to help you," he murmured into the wet fur. "I promise. I'm not going to leave you alone." The journey back was long and exhausting. The rain fell again, this time softer, more melancholic, as if the jungle itself cried with them, mourning the separation, the pain, the loss. Carlos walked with the little gorilla pressed to his chest, shielding it with his own body from the drops falling from the tall leaves. From time to time, the infant lifted its head weakly and looked at him with those huge eyes, full of questions it couldn't ask, but that Carlos could clearly read. "Where is my mother? Why am I alone? Who are you? Can I trust you?" Carlos had no answers to any of those questions. He only had will, determination, and a silent promise he had made in that wet clearing. When he reached the cabin, he lit the portable heater and prepared a dry blanket he had kept in the closet. He placed the little one on the wooden table with infinite care and examined it with expert but trembling hands. There were no visible wounds, no cuts or scratches, but it was clearly hypothermic and dehydrated. Its tiny lips trembled uncontrollably, and its breathing was shallow and irregular. Worrying. Carlos knew the next few hours would be critical. He had seen animals die of hypothermia even after being rescued. Time was his enemy now. He worked for hours without rest, driven by an urgency he hadn't felt in years. He gave it warm water with a small syringe, drop by drop to avoid choking. He dried it with soft towels, rubbing gently to avoid hurting its sensitive skin. He wrapped it in thermal blankets he kept for emergencies. The little gorilla didn't stop looking at him with those huge, expressive eyes, as if trying to understand what was happening, who this stranger was who touched it with such gentleness. Outside, night fell dense and dark, with no stars visible through the heavy clouds still covering the sky. The rain beat on the tin roof in a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm, creating a monotonous melody that filled the cabin's silence. Carlos sat beside the table, watching every breath of the infant, counting the seconds between each inhalation and exhalation. He couldn't sleep. He didn't want to. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of the little gorilla clinging to that branch, crying in the loneliness of the devastated jungle. At dawn, when the first gray rays of light filtered through the window, the little one opened its eyes fully for the first time since the rescue. It no longer shook with violent spasms. Its breathing was more stable, deeper, more regular. When it saw Carlos leaning over it, it didn't recoil in fear. It only watched him with cautious curiosity, tilting its head slightly as primates do when studying something new. Carlos smiled, tired but deeply relieved, feeling the weight of worry lighten a little. "Welcome back, little one. I knew you were strong." Over the following days, the ranger became an improvised father, a role for which there was no formal training, but one he assumed with total dedication. He prepared a special formula for baby primates, mixing the powders precisely according to instructions he had learned years ago in a wildlife rescue course. He fed it every 3 hours, even at night, waking up with alarms that interrupted his fragmented sleep. He kept it warm, changed its blankets, cleaned its waste with the patience of someone who understands that life is fragile and deserves respect. The little gorilla gradually began to respond, showing signs of recovery that filled Carlos with hope. It clung to his arm when it was afraid, especially when it heard distant thunder reminding it of the storm. It made soft sounds when it was calm, a kind of guttural purring baby gorillas make when they feel safe. It even began exploring the cabin with clumsy steps, touching objects with curiosity, learning about this strange world it had awakened into. Carlos knew he couldn't keep it forever. The law was clear, and more importantly, his conscience was clear. This little being belonged to the jungle, to its family, to its species. But he also knew he couldn't return it without first making sure it was fully ready, that it had a real chance to survive. A week later, while reviewing the trap cameras he had installed in the area of the rescue, he found something that left him completely breathless, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Footage of a group of gorillas, and among them, clearly visible in the grainy video, an adult female searching among the bushes with frantic movements, sniffing the ground, turning her head constantly, as if looking for something lost, something invaluable. Carlos felt his heart race until it almost hurt. It was her. It had to be the mother. That afternoon, as the sun began to descend toward the horizon, Carlos took the little one in his arms with a mixture of determination and sadness tightening his chest. The infant clung to his jacket with absolute trust, not knowing what was about to happen, not understanding that this journey was different from the short walks they had taken around the cabin. They walked toward the exact spot where the images had been captured, following the GPS coordinates precisely. The little gorilla looked around curiously, pointing at birds and butterflies with its tiny fingers, making sounds of wonder that broke Carlos's heart into smaller and smaller pieces. They reached a natural clearing, an open space where sunlight fell in golden columns through the treetops. Carlos stopped in the center, feeling his legs tremble, and placed the little one on the ground with infinite care, as if setting down something sacred. The gorilla looked up at him, confused, with those big eyes full of questions. "Why are you putting me down? Aren't we going home?" "It's time to go home," Carlos whispered, his voice breaking from the emotion he had been holding back for days. "Your real home." Then he saw her, emerging from between the trees, moving with the caution of someone who has lost something precious and fears losing it again. The female appeared, large, powerful, her muscles visible beneath her dark, gleaming fur. Her intelligent, deep eyes locked immediately on the little one. She stopped a few meters away, tense like a spring, assessing the situation with the ancestral wisdom of her species. The infant recognized her instantly. Something primitive and deep ignited in its small brain. It let out a sharp cry full of recognition and relief, and ran toward her with clumsy but determined legs, stumbling over roots and stones, but never stopping. The mother received it with open arms, wrapping it in her massive chest, sniffing it desperately, checking it from head to toe with expert hands that searched for wounds, that confirmed it was real, that it had truly returned. She made deep, guttural sounds that resonated in her chest like a song of gratitude and relief. Then she lifted her gaze toward Carlos. Their eyes met across the space that separated them. There was no roar, no threat, no chest beating or show of dominance, only a deep look filled with something that transcended animal instinct, something that touched the realm of consciousness and complex emotion. Gratitude. Carlos saw it clearly in those dark eyes. She knew, somehow, at some deep level of understanding, she knew that this human had saved her child, that he had cared for it when it was alone and terrified, that he had returned it when he could have kept it. Carlos took a step back, hands open at his sides in a gesture of peace, respect, farewell. Tears ran freely down his sun and wind-burned cheeks, but he didn't care. There was no shame in crying over something so pure, so perfect. The female watched him for a few more seconds, memorizing his face somewhere deep in her memory. Then, with a smooth, graceful movement, she turned and began walking into the thicket. The little one, clinging to her back with hands and feet, turned its head one last time. Its eyes met Carlos's. It was just an instant, a blink in time, but Carlos knew the little one would also remember somehow, somewhere in its developing mind, the memory of the human who saved it. Carlos stood alone in the clearing, under the golden, fading light of the afternoon. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the oppressive, heavy silence after the storm. It was a full, complete silence, the kind that follows a perfectly played symphony. He didn't feel emptiness. He didn't feel loss. He felt wholeness, a sense of having fulfilled something greater than himself, something that transcended his daily work and official duties. He had returned what the storm had taken. He had closed a circle that nature had opened violently. He remained there until the light began to fade and shadows stretched between the trees like dark fingers. Only then did he turn and begin the long walk back to the cabin, his shoulders lighter despite the exhaustion in every muscle. That night, sitting at his worn wooden desk with the kerosene lamp casting dancing shadows on the walls, Carlos opened his field notebook. It was a habit he had kept throughout his years as a ranger, to document not only the facts, but also the reflections, the lessons the jungle constantly taught him. He wrote carefully, taking his time to find the right words. The jungle does not forget. It remembers every act, every gesture, every decision. And when a heart chooses to help without expecting anything in return, life always finds a way to repay the favor. Today, I learned that empathy is not exclusive to humans. It exists in the eyes of a mother who finds her child again. It exists in the trust of a baby clinging to a stranger. It exists in the invisible space that connects all living beings. He closed the notebook gently and turned off the lamp, letting darkness fill the cabin. But it wasn't complete darkness. The moon, almost full, had broken through the scattered clouds, and its silvery light filtered through the window, creating patterns on the wooden floor. Outside, the jungle had come back to life. Crickets sang their nocturnal symphony. Frogs croaked from the puddles left by the storm. Somewhere, an owl hooted in the distance. Everything had returned to its natural rhythm, the eternal pulse of life that continues no matter what storms shake it. Carlos lay down on his cot, but before closing his eyes, he heard something that made him smile in the darkness. A deep, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere deep in the jungle. A chest-beating drum. It was the sound male gorillas make to communicate over long distances, to mark territory, to send messages only their species fully understands. But Carlos, after so many years in the jungle, had learned to interpret the nuances, the variations, the intentions behind those sounds. This wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a warning. It was something different. It was recognition, a greeting, a farewell, a thank you. The message had been received. Carlos closed his eyes, feeling a deep peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew that tomorrow he would return to his routine, to his patrols, his reports, the thousand small tasks that made up his daily work. But he also knew something had changed. He had witnessed something extraordinary, something most people would never experience. He had touched, if only briefly, that invisible thread connecting all living beings, that universal language that transcends species and words. And as he drifted to sleep to the song of the jungle, Carlos knew he would never forget those eyes, the eyes of the little gorilla who cried in the storm, the eyes of the mother who found what she thought was lost, the eyes that taught him that compassion knows no boundaries.